The people who laugh first are often the ones who never looked closely enough to see the danger coming. Before sunrise, 13-year-old Everett Crane stood knee-deep in mud along Coldwater Creek, driving thin willow cuttings into the bank with a borrowed spade. His boots were soaked, his palms blistered, and by the fourth morning, nearly everyone in the county had an opinion. They said he was planting shade trees where floods tore through every few years. Some smiled. Others shook their heads and called it another foolish idea from a quiet farm boy.
Everett never argued. He measured the bank in careful steps, tied strips of red cloth to the weakest sections, and checked a creek against marks scratched into an old fence post. Every few minutes, he opened a small notebook and wrote down numbers no one else understood. Then he returned to planting, one willow every few feet, from the pasture gate to the wide bend where the current always struck hardest. His father watched from the barn without offering praise or warning. Everett's neighbors waited for him to explain himself, but he only tightened his grip on the spade. He knew something about that creek they had stopped noticing, and he was willing to look foolish until the land proved him right. And winter closed in around him.
But the reason Everett saw danger where everyone else saw ordinary farmland had begun long before the first willow touched the mud. On the Crane family's tobacco and cattle farm in Casey County, Kentucky, he was rarely the child people praised. His older brother Micah brought home ribbons from the county fair. His younger sister Lena earned the grades that made teachers remember her name. Everett had no trophy shelf, no loud talent, and no habit of asking to be noticed. What he had was patience. Every Sunday morning he walked the fence line alone, studying the ground as if it were trying to tell him something. He noticed when the south field drained slower than it had the year before. He found a loose strand of wire 3 days before the cattle pushed through it. He could tell where rainwater had begun cutting a new path across the pasture and where the creek had stolen another inch of soil. None of this looked impressive from a distance, but Everett's gift was never strength, speed, or brilliance. It was attention. He saw the small changes people stopped seeing because they had lived beside them too long, and along Coldwater Creek, those small changes were adding up to a warning no one else had heard. The bank was weakening quietly, and Everett knew silence did not mean safety. But the answer Everett needed did not come from the creek itself. It came from a man who had spent 30 years listening to land before it failed. The previous summer, Everett had stayed with his grandfather, Lester Bowen, a retired soil conservation technician in Bourbon County. One evening, Lester led him to a neighboring farm where the creek bank had collapsed in long, ragged bites. "You know what holds ground like this together?" he asked. Everett shook his head. Lester pointed to a stand of black willows farther downstream. Their roots, he explained, spread quickly through wet soil, weaving beneath the bank like living rope. They slowed the current along the edge, trapped loose sediment, and bent under pressure instead of snapping. Before Everett left, Lester handed him a worn county extension booklet on stabilizing stream banks with native vegetation. Everett read it twice on the bus home. Then he walked every damaged stretch of Coldwater Creek, comparing the diagrams with the undercut soil, exposed roots, and widening bends on his family's farm. He marked where the current struck hardest and where each storm carried away another strip of ground. Everett was not copying an old man's advice blindly. He was testing proven knowledge against a problem he knew by heart. By the time he closed that booklet, the willow cuttings were no longer trees in his mind. They were a living barrier, and perhaps the only thing standing between his family's pasture and the next great flood. But knowing what might save the farm meant nothing unless Everett was willing to risk something of his own. All summer he had worked beneath the heat on the Atchison place, lifting hay bales until his shoulders burned and his palms split open. He had been saving for a used blue bicycle he had admired for months in the hardware store window. Instead, he counted every dollar twice, folded the money into an envelope, and ordered bundles of willow cuttings from a conservation nursery. Nearly all his summer earnings disappeared in a single payment. When he asked his father for permission to plant them, Dale Crane studied him for a long moment. "Long as your chores are finished," he said. That was not encouragement, but it was enough.
Everett hauled the cuttings to Coldwater Creek alone, measured the spacing, and pressed each one into the damp bank. Harlan Beecham called them sticks in the mud. Gus Whitfield warned that the next flood would carry them clear to Tennessee. Even Everett's own family watched without fully believing. No one helped him dig. No one promised the idea would work. But every time he looked toward the road and imagined that bicycle, he tightened his grip on the spade. He had traded something he wanted for a chance to protect something his family could never replace. For him, that choice made every cutting more than a tree. It became a promise buried in the soil. But the first winter did not test Everett's idea gently. It attacked every weakness at once. In January, a hard freeze blackened several willow tips and killed entire rows near the open pasture. Before he could replace them, cattle pushed through a loose section of temporary fencing and trampled 12 more cuttings into the mud. Gus Whitfield passed by, glanced at the broken sticks, and muttered that Everett might as well have planted broom handles. For the first time, Everett wondered if the whole county had been right. Still, he did not simply start over the same way. He rebuilt the fence with closer posts and an extra strand of wire, then recorded exactly where the damage had occurred. He rooted replacement cuttings in buckets of creek water inside the barn and planted them deeper than before. In May, aphids curled the new leaves and weakened another section, so Everett treated the healthiest plants first and marked the losses in his notebook. By late summer, drought cracked the exposed bank, and 2 saplings near the sharpest bend turned brown. This time he changed the spacing, placing new cuttings closer together where the current struck hardest. At the end of each month, he counted every survivor, compared one section with another, and calculated which method gave the roots the best chance. The numbers were not encouraging, but they were teaching him something. Failure was showing him where the system was weak. Each dead cutting became evidence. Each repair became an improvement. And every insult from the road became another reason to keep working. Everett was no longer defending a foolish experiment. He was refining a plan the land itself was helping him understand. By autumn, that thin green line still standing beside the creek had become his first real proof. But while the county forgot about Everett's experiment, the creek was quietly preparing the only test that mattered. By the second year, the surviving willows had changed. Their trunks were thicker, the branches reached over the water, and beneath the bank, roots had spread through the soil like a hidden net. Neighbors no longer stopped to joke. To them, the trees had become part of the scenery. Then the summer turned brutally dry, and October answered with 11 straight days of rain. At first, Everett watched the fields darken and soften. By the 5th day, water stood in the wheel ruts. By the 8th, the bank stayed wet even hours after the rain eased. He remembered the 3 warnings his grandfather had taught him: saturated soil, debris moving faster than the current usually carried it, animals abandoning low ground before people understood why. Soon, branches and fence scraps spun through Coldwater Creek, and the killdeer that nested near the bank began feeding uphill. Everett checked the watermarks on the old fence post and found the creek climbing faster each hour. That afternoon, the county issued a flood advisory. Before supper, he walked the willow line alone, pressing one hand against the trunks while brown water shoved hard at the bank. The trees bent, but they did not loosen. Under his boots, the soil trembled, and the buried roots pulled tight like cables under strain. The question was whether 2 years of patience could truly keep generations of soil from washing away overnight. Everett knew then that the flood was no longer coming. It had already begun. But what happened before sunrise would prove whether Everett had been foolish or whether everyone else had waited too long to understand him. Coldwater Creek broke over its banks in the dark, spreading across the low fields with a force that tore fence posts from the ground and dragged wire, branches, and feed barrels downstream. By morning, Gus Whitfield had lost 60 feet of creek bank from his north pasture. The edge where his fence had stood was gone, replaced by a raw wall of collapsing earth.
Farther east, 3 of the Atchison fence lines lay twisted in debris nearly 200 yards away. Rufus Dinkins watched brown water strip through the hay meadow he had spent 12 years improving, carrying off rich topsoil in sheets.
The Crane farm flooded too. Water covered the low edge of the south pasture, flattened grass, and left mud against the lower fence rails. The Willows had not stopped the flood, and Everett had never expected them to. Their purpose was quieter and more important: to keep the moving water from taking the land with it. When Dale and Everett reached the creek, the trees were bent almost flat beneath the current. Several branches had snapped, and roots showed through the washed surface. Yet the bank remained where it had been. Beneath the mud, hundreds of fibrous roots had woven through the soil, gripping it like a flexible net. Instead of resisting the water as a rigid wall might, the willows bent with the pressure, slowed the current along the edge, and trapped sediment that would otherwise have disappeared downstream. The channel had widened slightly, but it had not shifted into the pasture. Behind the willow line, most of the Crane family's valuable topsoil remained intact. Everett stood in the rain, staring at the battered trees he had planted, replaced, measured, and defended for 2 years. They looked damaged, but they were still holding. His preparation had not made the farm invincible. It had done something far more believable and far more valuable. It had reduced the loss, protected the ground that could not be replaced, and given the farm a chance to recover after the water went down. And that difference would soon change them. But the flood's greatest surprise was not that Everett had saved one bank. It was how quickly silent proof changed the minds of everyone who had doubted him. The following Monday, Gus Whitfield crossed the muddy pasture and stood beside the willow line, staring at the roots gripping soil that the water had failed to carry away. He never apologized. He simply asked where Everett had bought the cuttings. Everett wrote the nursery's name on a scrap of feed paper, and Gus folded it into his pocket. By spring, willows appeared along Gus's damaged bank. Then Harlan Beecham planted a row. The Atchisons followed the year after that. Everett never reminded them who had been right. He let the creek speak for him. Several years later, the farmers of Coldwater Creek formed a shared restoration project using Everett's original notes, survival records, spacing measurements, and flood marks. What began as one boy's quiet experiment became miles of living protection along the water. Fences still broke, fields still flooded, and storms still came, but less soil disappeared each season. Everett had not defeated nature. He had taught his community how to work with it. Sometimes wisdom looks foolish only because its results have not arrived yet. That lesson kept growing after the flood passed. If this story made you think of someone who kept going while others laughed, tell us about them below. And subscribe to Solace Farm Stories for more unforgettable stories of courage, patience, and the land.